Welcome to the Vernuccio Novak Report and the American Political Zone. From New York, this is Frank Vernuccio.
And on location in Minnesota, this is John Wilson.
Well, John, it's great that you're there. Certainly, as a former judge, we are fascinated to hear your take on the Chauvin trial verdict.
Well, unfortunately, my take is not a positive one. That's not at least a fully positive one. Let's start with the positive aspect of the Chauvin verdict. Once the verdict was read, there weren't any riots. As I'm sure you and all the listeners are aware, there was a great fear here in Minnesota and across the country that any not guilty verdict on any counts would have led to a rioting. While there's been protesting and while there has been unrest, the level of rioting that would have expected if he was even acquitted of one of the charges did not happen. So actually, Minnesotans here have overall breathed a great sigh of relief over that aspect. Unfortunately, what they're breathing a sigh of relief over is a miscarriage of justice. Quite frankly, whether or not Chauvin is guilty of some level of malfeasance, and I'm not arguing that he isn't, so let's be clear there. This was not a fair trial. And there's no way, no interpretation of this that can lead one to believe this was a fair trial. While the jury was being selected, the city of Minneapolis settled a civil lawsuit for millions of dollars with the family, sending a signal to all of the potential jurors that the city of Minneapolis thought that the officer was responsible for what happened, and publicizing the amounts of that responsibility as well. It is possible to settle a case of that nature by not revealing the amounts of money that was achieved in settlement. Nobody did that in this case. That was the beginning of prejudicing the jury. Then you have the president of the United States making comments that he's hoping the jury comes to the right verdict and making it pretty clear he thinks that right verdict is a guilty verdict. That's interference at a very high level in the functions of the judicial branch. And then third, and most disturbing to me in a lot of ways, was that a California congresswoman, Maxine Waters, comes to Minnesota and basically tells the populace there, we're going to keep these people rioting in the streets unless you come back with, again, the right verdict. Even the judge, Judge Cahill, came back and told the defense that he believed that this created an appellate issue. So how anyone can think that this trial was fair is beyond me.
John, question from your experience on the bench. It would seem to me that the defense attorney would have done one of two things. Number one, argue for a change of venue to begin with. And number two, possibly have this case held in camera just before the judge, not before a jury, who is, you assume a judge would be less likely to be swayed by, the disorder and the publicity around it. Why weren't those things done?
I do believe the defense did make a motion to change venue, and that motion was denied. I'm pretty certain, I remember reading that. I haven't researched it, but I'm pretty certain the defense did make that motion.
Considering all the atmosphere around it, it would appear that that would certainly be one grounds for appeal as well.
Absolutely. If a change of venue was warranted and was not granted, that is definitely a basis for an appeal there alone. The second issue that you discussed, remind me again.
Appearing just before the judge in camera, not before a jury. A judge would be much more, you would assume, unpersuaded by publicity.
All right, not necessarily. Judges are human beings too. Depending upon the facts of a case, when I've tried cases in the past, I've waived the jury as well. And I've typically done that in cases involving sex offenses. Just because I thought a jury would be less emotional, or a jury would be more emotional, a judge less emotional. Here, I'm not going to second guess the defense strategy of why they would want to have a jury. They may have been feeling that some jurors might have felt differently than others and at least achieved a hung jury or a compromise verdict of a lesser charge. That's the strategy, and I think the defense attorney is entitled to whatever his strategy was in that regard. Also, it's harder to influence 12 people on a jury and a judge rather than just a judge. So if the judge was the only one trying the case, it might be more difficult for him to remain neutral. The pressure on the judge would be more intense. As it is, we barely know this judge's name. While we may not know who the jurors are, we do know that they were not sequestered until the time of the verdict, and so they were subject to influence. So what I'm saying is, did the defense strategy work? Perhaps not, but that's an issue for appeal.
John, I have become increasingly disturbed at what is now an obvious habit here in the United States of attempting to influence court decisions by mob action. You know, you almost got the sense that the mob in Michigan, in Minnesota rather, would not have been satisfied with anything less than taking Chauvin out and hanging him from a tree outside the courtroom. When do you think we turn that corner in America where we used to say, look, I want this to happen or I want that to happen, but I have faith in the system. I'll let it play out. It seems that we've abandoned that trust in the judicial system.
I think part of the reason for that is the increase in media coverage nationwide for incidents such as this. In the past, while it might have been easier to cover up wrongdoing, which we're not going to deny has happened, at the same time, the increased media attention for incidents like this has created a cycle of pressure on those participants in the justice system to make sure that they get it right. Because if they don't get it right as the media reads it, they're going to be excoriated. So I think that cycle of media attention and wanting to feed the mob of their viewers is what's creating this issue now.
You know, there is a common element in all of these cases where there's a police shooting of a suspect, and that common element is resisting arrest. Now, it seems that there is a growing cultural issue where resisting arrest is almost some kind of mark of honor. One person commented, and I think it was well said, that at the end of the trial, Chauvin put his hands behind his back for the handcuffs to go on and was rather peaceably led away. The comment was made that if Floyd had done that, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this case. Floyd would be alive and well, and this would not be an issue at all.
Well, keep in mind that Floyd was, as the autopsy shows, under the influence of drugs, and that would definitely have clouded his judgment at the time of his arrest. Yes, there does seem to be a culture now of resisting arrest, not listening to an officer when you're instructed to follow those instructions. For instance, the recent shooting of Daunte Wright in Brooklyn Center. The video clearly shows that if Daunte Wright had cooperated with his arrest, he would not have been in a position to have the officer make that mistake between her taser and her gun. He would have been led away. And in the current environment, by the way, he more than likely would have been released with either a modest bail or no bail, because the philosophy now in the courts is to release people on the less restrictive measures that you can ensure their return to court. So Daunte Wright didn't really have a lot to fear in being taken into custody. He had the odds in his favor that he would have been released within 24 hours.
And indeed, there is really no indication in any of these cases that any suspects of this sort are beaten or otherwise harassed when in police custody. It's only after resisting arrest that these tragedies seem to occur.
Yeah, the days of, as you might recall, Abner Louima, who was arrested and used in a police station.
Yeah.
Those days are over. There is surveillance cameras almost everywhere. Either they're in the street, or they're in the jail facilities, or they're in the police precincts. So things like that are just not as likely to happen as they were in the past. Unless, of course, you're Jeffrey Epstein and then the surveillance system fails and your supposed suicide is somehow not recorded.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the yet another unexplained person connected to the Clintons who somehow mysteriously dies before they're able to tell all in court.
Well, not to spread conspiracy theories, but it is very unusual that a man who is only the second suicide ever to occur in the Metropolitan Correctional Facility and was on suicide watch. Somehow the suicide watch was removed right before his suicide. It's quite the confluence of events.
It certainly is. How do we get this back on track? Look, we've seen in places like New York and LA where criminals are being released, or suspects rather, are being released without bail on their own recognizance in some cases. In Los Angeles, the local sheriff was mentioning that, or the local, sheriff was mentioning that he has no relationship with the district attorney. That increasingly throughout the United States, we're seeing these politically motivated district attorneys and state attorneys general who view their position not as helping to enforce the law, but essentially as pushing a political agenda.
I think what you're going to need to see increasingly is a return to a more traditional form of education. And I'm echoing Daria when I discuss this issue, I know. But where have we really gone wrong? At the heart of it is the education that's being provided now. I've written a series of articles for usagovpolicy.com. Recently, one was published discussing the proposals for woke math. I have another article coming up discussing California's ethics study or ethnic study program that again is teaching children as young as kindergarten to worship the Aztecs gods.
Hey, come on! What's wrong with human sacrifice, John? You right?
That depends on who you're sacrificing, I guess, right?
Hey, let's go to our first guest. Pastor and author Lucas Miles addresses the dangers of progressive Christianity in his new book, The Christian Left: How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church. Pastor Miles, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Tell us a bit about your thoughts, the motivations for writing the book.
Yeah, so, I've been a pastor since I started preaching at 17. I'll be 42 this year. And really over the last probably 5 to 10 years, I have seen what the New York Times has described as this ascendant liberal Christianity, really this rise of what I call the Christian left, this growing constituency of left-leaning Christians and sometimes so-called Christians who have embraced liberal theology, progressive ideology, and oftentimes Marxist theory, like critical race theory. And they have really, brought this into and sort of morphed it with the definition of what it means to be Christian, and really produced this heretical belief that is really invading the church very rampantly right now.
Now, we go back a couple of decades actually, and we heard about liberation theology within the Catholic Church in Latin America. And now, of course, we have a Pope in the Catholic Church that is sort of a graduate of that school of liberation theology to some extent. Does it seem that Christian sects are becoming more focused on the here and now rather than on the really great moral questions of the day? You go back to reading the New Testament, and Jesus walked the earth at a time when, of course, the Roman Empire was predominant, certainly in the area in which he lived and worked. The Roman Empire held that country of Israel in thrall, and yet Christ refused to get involved in partisan politics of the day. Does it seem that the Christian sects of today are ignoring what Christ did and basically running their own political course?
It's interesting. I mean, I've traced the Christian left and progressive Christianity back as far as the 1700s, and you can make arguments that, even within Scripture, we see examples of, within the Garden of Eden or the Tower of Babel or different instances. More in more modern, times, you mentioned liberation theology. Liberation theology, first, as you mentioned, was sort of this hybrid between Catholicism and Marxism that took place in Latin America. Founder of that was a guy named Gutierrez. And then, even within in America, there is what known as Black liberation theology that was started. James Cone, who really wrote the book on it, wrote it about 50 years ago. And this became much more sort of militant in its presentation. And he actually, in his book, The Theology of Black Liberation, encourages things like, if you're willing to do whatever it takes in order to bring God's will to take down these people that he deems as oppressors, even if it means firebombing buildings and rioting. This is the same playbook that we're seeing the left utilize today. So liberation theology, it's really grown beyond, just what we've seen in the Catholic Church or just what we've seen in Black liberation theology. And I think a lot of local churches that, everyday community churches that people are attending have embraced this ideology, sometimes not even realizing that they have. And it is just slowly eroded biblically held beliefs and pushed them further and further into this kind of progressive version of Christianity that is really antithetical to Jesus' teaching.
Pastor, I'm John Wilson, and I'm old enough to remember when Pope John Paul excoriated this priest who had been a member of the Sandinistas as he got off the plane, publicly wagging his finger in the man's face and telling him that while we couldn't hear what he was saying, it was pretty clear he was criticizing him for his political involvement. But that was John Paul the second. Now we have Pope Francis. How are Pope Francis's policies encouraging this return of liberation theology?
Pope Francis, I would describe, he's kind of like that skateboarder that, is in the half pipe and you keep expecting him to flip over the side of the thing because he goes up on the rails all the time, he is doing his best, it appears, to try to at least stay orthodox enough that he's not excommunicated himself, if that's even possible. But there's certainly things that seem concerning. And I'm encouraged by the fact that the Catholic Church here recently, seemed to take a strong stance, on the side of traditional, marriage and gender. But yet there's these side comments that come sometimes from Francis. And so sometimes when Francis is speaking sort of by himself, he comes across as much more progressive, much more liberal. And then when it's sort of the church presenting kind of the full view, you can tell that there's more of a panel discussion, that's writing those edicts and things that are coming down. And so I'm certainly concerned about somebody like Francis. I don't think that, he's doing a lot of favors for Orthodox Christianity on any level right now. But it seems to be enough people that have at least, temporarily kept him in line, that, it's certainly something to watch and something I definitely write about in this book, The Christian Left.
If I can go in another direction with you there, Pastor, going to illegal immigration, I think you're aware that both the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church in particular, have vast organizations within themselves that Catholic Charities and Lutheran Social Service I'm talking about that go far towards sponsoring refugees as they categorize it. What's your view on the support that's actually being provided for illegal immigration by these organizations?
I've not read specifically on both of their, kind of bylaws of what they're stating, but the reality is that if you look at America's history, this, it is really unarguable that this is a nation that was founded upon Judeo-Christian values. And we've had times in America's history where we've actually completely halted immigration just to give time for people that immigrate here to really assimilate into American culture and American values, and so that the nation is not just flooded with ideology that does not understand, for instance, freedom of speech or our constitutional values that we have. And so there's been times where history has done, where our founders have done a great job of creating some checks and balances of that. If people actually had to have a relationship with, say, a sponsor or a church in order to, find, opportunity to be able to, immigrate here in the United States, it would probably prevent a lot of problems. I'm sure there's a lot more smarter people than I am to be able to address some of the actual laws and how that should stay. But certainly, I understand that, churches, we want to be the hands and feet of Jesus, and we want to help meet felt needs. But the problem is that oftentimes it's kind of like when you're steering the car down the road and you start to go one way and you jerk it really hard the other way. The progressive left has really jerked the wheel very hard towards the left. And it's really introducing a class system, dividing people based upon race and nationality. And I think that we've only begun to see the problems that are going to come out of really the progressive view of immigration and race.
Religion is something that has been able to take one out of the hate the back and forth of politics and unite people together. I've been told increasingly in various churches, both the Catholic Church and in a variety of Christian churches, that people are becoming increasingly uncomfortable at what they perceive to be politics from the pulpit. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't, when you look at scripture, a understanding of religion and understanding of Christian theology, you cannot separate that from Christian theology speaking to every single aspect of life. And so to handcuff pastors and say you can't talk about anything that might be deemed political, that's the same type of censorship that we're getting from big tech right now. I mean, I have, my book here, The Christian Left. Our whole campaign was set up to be able to run ads on social media to promote it. And, we can't even run an ad on Facebook for this book, despite the fact that, fortunately, it's still hit #1 on Amazon without this, but because it has the word left in it and the word liberal in the title. And so we've been blocked from running ads. I don't want to see the church become something that we can't address issues. Gender, sexuality, immigration, these are all political issues, but there's moral issues behind those things that pastors and clergy need to be free to be able to address. But we need to do so in a way that aligns itself with scripture and not just, kind of try to force, certain scriptures just to fit into our politics. And that's really what we're seeing is the Bible has become, just a tool on the side of the left to just, kind of promote their propaganda, and they kind of pick and choose which verses they want to hold on to and use those as very convincingly to try to lead people into believing this heresy, that I call in this book, The Christian Left.
Now, a couple of years ago, we saw I believe it was in the city of Houston, the mayor, rather shockingly, demanded that pastors give copies of their upcoming sermons to her for clearance. Do you see more and more of a danger in the hard left beginning to try to work their way into controlling the church? I know in many cases we've heard demands that the Catholic Church be prosecuted because of their views on gay marriage, for example. Do you see this as more and more of a threat of government intervention in the internal actions of religion?
100%, and we're already seeing it in other countries. So there's countries in Europe where that practice is also being asked of them. I think there was also a petition for that same thing to happen in Atlanta a few years back as well, in addition to Houston. And so this is a huge danger. I mean, the whole notion of separation of church and state, of course, if anybody ever, a Christian ever prays in the Senate or Congress, the left cries separation of church and state. But in actuality, the left does not want a separation of church and state. They want a church that is subservient to the state, and they'll do whatever they can to make that happen. I call this in my book, The Christian Left, I call it Herodian politics. And in the Bible, there's a story of King Herod, and he used to love to hear John the Baptist preach, it says. And the problem was, until John the Baptist said something about Herod's own lifestyle, and of course, as a result, Herod had him thrown in prison. And this is the position that the left takes towards the church. They love the church as long as the church is in agreement with them, but the moment the church stands in opposition to the state will do whatever it can, to silence the church. And if it has to, like in the case with John the Baptist, they'll cut off its head if that's what it takes to get them to be quiet.
Following up on this issue, I'd like to ask your views on the church closings as a result of COVID restrictions. It seemed to me that you could go to a Target, or you could go to a Walmart, or you could go to the liquor store and buy lottery tickets in your car freely and going into the parking lot. But if you tried to have a church service in the parking lot of your church, the state came and shut it down. What's your view of that interference? Church functions.
So yeah, and this is still an issue that we're talking about a lot, and I'm in a red state but a blue county, and there was we had a health enforcement officer who felt very empowered and actually created an order. It was later deemed an illegal order, but our county council passed a law on that, based upon that illegal order, and put it into law on requirements for masks and numbers of people in buildings and these things. Our church, my church personally, has been open back up since the end of May. We shut down for a short period of time. We kind of saw a little bit the writing on the wall where this is going, and we thought, what, we're going to open. We're going to open safely. We've had 0 cases that we are aware of any transference within our church. We've had people that have gotten it at work, or people that got it from a family member that came in from out of town, but we have no instances of anybody catching COVID at church. And, you know, we sing and we greet each other, and it feels kind of like church as usual. I think there's a lot of pastors who, you know, they're fearful. They don't know their rights. They're afraid of conflict. They're kind of preaching a Christianity light, and they don't want to really take sides one way or the other. And the reality is, this isn't about Republican or Democrat. This is about, you know, whether or not we are teaching the gospel or not. This is the first time in church history, 2,000 years of church history, that the church around the entire planet shut down. And that's a problem. And, you know, maybe there was justification to do it for 15 days to slow the curve, right, or to stop the spread. But once we saw that this was an issue, and there was a new study, I think a Stanford study that just came out saying that, you know, masks are shown to not only be not effective, but also, you know, contribute to, you know, additional health issues. You know, we have a lot of things that we've been deciding based upon really one guy, Dr. Fauci, and we have embraced this as a nation wholeheartedly without really doing the science, without doing the research. And look, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a medical doctor, but I am a pastor. And what I can tell you is that as a pastor, I have seen more instances of addiction, divorce, domestic violence than I have ever seen in my entire 20 plus years of ministry that have taken place this last year. And I would almost in majority of these cases say that quarantining the healthy and churches being shut down is at the heart of these issues, and it could have prevented many of these issues if these people would have had a greater community around them and support that they typically had in their lives.
Well, it's often, it's been said in the Bible that the Lord helps those who help themselves. Shouldn't more of these pastors have gone to court and fought these COVID restrictions to reach out to their flocks?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I think that there are certainly some groups that have. So we're involved with a First Amendment law, you know, office that has been very active in fighting, you know, instances like this. The problem is that in many cases, this was, you know, it was sort of code enforcement that were put out there, but then they just really became sort of self-imposed from the church themselves. And I think that, you know, there's some instances of health departments showing up to church services, and that even happened here in our town where health departments marching into during the service to make sure people are wearing masks, make sure they're not having code violations. And this is a direct breach of people's constitutional rights and religious rights in this nation, but yet we've let it happen. And so thankfully, some of these cases, like in California, we've seen the Supreme Court, you know, speak into this, but the margins have still been very thin on some of the cases that religious freedom have won, which makes me concerned about what this looks like a few years down the road. I think we're really only starting to see the problems that this new kind of religious left that, you know, is trying to be sort of the beacon of morality is going to, try to inflict on us, you know, in this nation.
You know, as we've seen the rise of socialism in the United States, we've also seen that issue that seems to arise in most socialist countries, which is a disdain for religion. It seems that in authoritarian countries, it's the government that is the religion, and they are a jealous religion. So anytime someone practices their traditional faith, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, or anything else, the government of an authoritarian state seems to feel revolted by that. They are jealous of it. Do you see that becoming more of an issue as the United States becomes more accepting of socialism?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, this American socialism that's taking shape is a little bit different than some of the socialism that we see in other countries, in that there is a lot of individuals who are using religion as justification for socialism. And that's happened before in the past, but I think it's more pronounced here, you know, in America. And I think it's almost necessary to win over America with socialism, if that is possible, that it almost has to be shown as sort of a religious alternative, you know, to, maybe modern evangelicalism, the way that it's presented. And so, you know, Mikhail Gorbachev was one of the first ones that I remember saying that Jesus was the first great socialist, you know, and really used as sort of a justification of socialism. But we're seeing more and more of that language from people like, former Mayor Pete Buttigieg. We're seeing language like that from AOC that's really trying to justify the doctrines of socialism and critical race theory and other things based upon Jesus. And it's really Jesus viewed as the great social organizer rather than the savior of the world, which you'll never hear the left, talk about.
I've heard it said, Pastor, that Satan is very active in our world today. What's your view of that position?
I mean, as a Christian, I don't see how you could not hold to that position. The Bible says in 1 John, it says the whole world is under the control of the evil one. I talk about this in my book. This might be controversial for some Christians just because of how they've been, raised. But we have, you hear Christians a lot of times will say they'll say the phrase, God is in control. Well, in actuality, the Bible never uses that language. The Bible makes it very clear that God has given dominion and free will to man. Yes, God is in control of the big picture in the sense that he is the Alpha and the Omega, that he is the one that is, going to return, and he holds, the world and all creation in his hand. But God is not controlling, meaning that he is controlling all the movements of people on this earth. We have free will. We have free choice. And the Bible says that the whole world is under the control of the evil one, meaning that anyone who has not given their heart to the Lord, that's allowing the Lord to lead their life, is really choosing by default to participate in the plan of the enemy, which is just to work God's purposes on this earth to, as it says in John 10:10, to steal, kill, and destroy. And we see socialism as one of, and we could point to other things like maybe radical Islam and others, but we see these doctrines that arise that seem to be really focused on hate, destruction, of pushing other people down, dividing people. And the gospel unites people, and you can always tell the difference. How do people view forgiveness? How do people view offering grace to one another? Do people hold grudges? If so, they're probably not operating in Christianity. Do they have to bring vengeance upon others? Do they have to force their hand? These are not Christian concepts. The Bible teaches self-sacrifice and dying to ourselves.
I've got to ask you this before we let you go. What's your thought on the California school district that essentially doesn't want to talk about Christianity or Judeo-Christian ethic, but does want to talk about how wonderful those Aztecs were, human sacrifice and all?
Yeah, I mean, look, I heard you guys talking about this as I was coming on. It's an issue. I mean, our curriculum, and I have I have a lot of school teachers, in my family, and I'm so thankful for teachers. They have a very tough job. But getting away from classical education it's really shown itself to be a major problem. I believe that every kid in the world should be reading Augustine. They should be reading Plato. They should be reading the New Testament. They should be reading the Old Testament. They need to get back to really being taught logic and taught, and instead we're just teaching nonsense and pagan gods and all sorts of things. And of course, there's good systems out there, and there's good teachers that are still left in this nation, and I'm thankful for them. But if the left continues to have their way, they want to continue to really introduce, more and more curriculum that I think is really not only counterintuitive for our faith, but really counterproductive for the freedoms that we have in this nation. And so I'm concerned about where that's going, here over the next few years.
Pastor Lucas Miles, thank you so much, and we look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you.
Hey, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And John, it sounds amusing, but the whole concept of teaching Aztec religion, we're accusing the European settlers of committing theocide, the assassination of Indian gods. You have to wonder the logic of all of this. I think there's something deeper. I think the Judeo-Christian ethic is considered part and parcel, as it is, by the way, of the entire Western philosophical thought. And socialism, which is anti-Western thought for the most part, has to attack that religious ethic if it's going to advance at all.
Yes, as you'll see in my upcoming article on this topic in usagovpolicy.com, the teachers aren't so much trying to get the students to worship the Aztec gods again, as it is to show the ancient philosophy that was lost to the theocide of the Spanish conquistadors. The idea is that this indigenous school of thought was lost as a result of the Spanish missionaries. What they're not telling these students is that there's good reasons why the people were willing to maybe perhaps make that change. I discussed in the article that some of the human sacrifice practiced in worship of these Aztec gods involved the sacrifice of children. And I don't want to terrorize anybody with the thoughts of what happened, but in the article, I do go into some detail about the brutality that was visited upon these children. It was the worship of the god of rain. And it was believed that if you made the children cry as you were torturing them, that pleased the god of rain and brought more rain for the harvests. Why anybody would want to continue a philosophy of that nature when there was a philosophy of love and of participation in a loving God who didn't want your children to suffer as an alternative. But you're right. The idea is this: the socialists who are perpetrating, who are indoctrinating the children, they believe that anything indigenous was, of course, better than anything that was brought in afterwards by either capitalist or Christian systems. And so they believe that this is proper to go back to these indigenous philosophies, no matter how brutal they might have been.
If you take as a whole what the left has been perpetrating, it's almost a rejection of American nationhood from its very start. They are against concepts like freedom of speech. They are against the concepts of limited government. And I think it seems to be part of the whole rejection of what America is all about.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to that 1619 project, for
Right.
instance. The whole idea of that is this nation was begun basically as a slave trading post, which is not the history of this nation. Did it exist? Of course it did, but it's not the whole basis for our economy of the 1600s through the revolutionary times. That's just nonsense.
John, let's welcome our next guest. U.S. Army Chaplain Colonel David J. Giamano retired in 2018 after 32 years of military service. He's a scholar, author, writer, and speaker who oversees the Warrior Refuge, a 46-acre ministry resort near Columbus, Georgia. His new book is The Military Guide to Armageddon, Battle-Tested Strategies to Prepare Your Life and Soul for the End Times. Chaplain, welcome to the program.
It is great to be with you today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion, and I know there's a lot of important topics we can talk about today.
Tell us a bit about the Warrior Refuge.
Well, initially, the Warrior Refuge, I modeled it to take care of our veterans because I've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder after 3 combat tours, and so I was helping veterans. But then things really began to change dynamically in the last couple of years. And so the Warrior Refuge has actually become Battle Ready Ministries, where right now we're traveling the nation and really the world and training people on these battle-tested strategies and how to prepare for all the events that are happening on the planet right now. And it's highly successful. Right now I'm in California getting ready to do another conference this weekend. We just did another conference last weekend in Sacramento. So these things are just beginning to pile up because people are very, very interested in what we have to say and how to prepare them for these end times.
Every generation thinks that perhaps that we're more of a mess than we ever were before. Things are more disordered than they ever were before. But I think this time around, if you're living in the United States and you look at the upheaval, the rejection of traditional American values, traditional American thought, it does seem that we are in perhaps more of a odd time than existed before, perhaps any time since the Civil War. If you go back to the 1960s, there was certainly a great deal of upheaval in the country, but it seemed that they were about specific issues. There was always a fundamental belief that America was a great place, that freedom for the individual was a good thing. Those basic core values seem to be questioned greater now than ever before. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you're exactly right. I think we are living in unprecedented times, and there is a move by a small group in this country to try to overturn our government, overthrow and bring socialism, communism, and then eventually a global network around the world. there is a move like that right now, like never before. So, last 2,000 years, they've been talking about the end times and things changing radically. But I think we're actually seeing a convergence of all these things happening. And now with the Great Reset in Davos, Switzerland, and other places where these billionaires and movers or shakers are trying to reset the economy and bring the world together, so we don't, blow ourselves up. Because right now we have Russia on the edge of the Crimea and Ukraine. We've got Turkey and Iran on Israel. We've got North Korea firing missiles. We got China flying planes over Taiwan. I mean, the world, if you look at the 1920s in all the things that happened leading up to the 30s and the 40s, we're recycling ourselves, but on a greater global scale than never before. There's a lot of things going on right now. Absolutely.
Chaplain, this is John Wilson. I'd like to thank you first for your service, particularly in Afghanistan. My nephew, E.J. Wilson, was with the Seabees in Afghanistan. So
Yeah.
I can understand some of what you're talking about with the post-traumatic stress after having served in such a place. I'm a student of the Book of Revelations, and
Okay.
talking about the end times obviously implies that there's an antichrist. I've heard it said before, I don't know how much of a subscriber I am to this view, but Barack Obama was identified as the antichrist. I think that talk died down after he was no longer president of the United States, and now I'm hearing people identifying Joe Biden as the potential antichrist. Whether or not those persons are or not, do you believe that there is an antichrist present in the world today? And if so, who might he be?
Well, in fact, I agree with you 100%. I mean, there's an antichrist spirit in some of these individuals that people are identifying. Just like if I was living in the 1920s and 30s and saw the rise of Adolf Hitler, I would have identified him as a potential antichrist. So, people are looking at these power players like Barack Obama, Joe Biden, others, and trying to identify who the Antichrist is. The honest truth is, I don't know who the Antichrist is. I do believe that person is probably alive right now on this planet. And, I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of scholars, and I've looked into it for 45 years. Fact of the matter is, the Lord said to watch and pray. Will that Antichrist come out of Turkey? Possibly. Out of the Middle East, Israel, there's a possibility. Out of the United States, probably unlikely, but also possible. But what is going to happen is the reason for the rise of the Antichrist is because the world is going to go in such a chaotic spin, with economic upheavals, global disasters, those kinds of things, maybe global war that we're on the brink of right now. So someone has to come on the planet and say, hey, I'm going to bring you peace. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to give you jobs. I'm going to bring this world back into order. That would be the Antichrist. And so we're watching to see how things play out here in the days and months and years to come.
Are we seeing a period of extraordinary danger? You mentioned Russia and the Ukraine and China and Taiwan and all that. In the end of the Second World War saw a period where I think Western open values became the predominant philosophy. And I think over the past 20 years, we've seen a lack of confidence in those values. Has that rejection really put us in the condition we are now?
Oh, I think absolutely. I was in the Army War College in 2012, and our peer-to-peer enemies, i.e. China and Russia, were the biggest concerns, not the globalist terrorist threat. But at that time, the terrorists were a significant source of a threat to us. However, I'll just be honest with you, with the lack of leadership, now that the other countries see in the United States, that vacuum of leadership is creating chaos in the world right now. And so they're raising up the stakes to see who is going to be the major player on this planet. China wants to be dominant, so does Russia. Could we be on the brink of World War III? I don't want to scare people, but the signs are all there that we're actually at a place of a major global conflict. I don't know how it's going to play out, but one wrong move in the next weeks and months. We have 180,000 plus Russian soldiers on the Ukraine. You know, if that doesn't raise your eyebrows, nothing will. So there's a lot of things going on right now that could lead us into a next global war with no problem whatsoever.
So can I ask you a question that I just asked our last guest as well? I've heard it said that Satan is very active in our world today. What's your view on that position?
In our book, The Military Guide to Armageddon, the back cover, he turned around and says, we are at war right now. Well, we have been at war with Satan and dark forces for 6,000 years. Out of the 6,000 years, we've only had 268 years of peace. So there are global dark forces around the world that are gathering all these nations together. And so whoever your guest was last time, and if he said, yeah, I'm in agreement 100%. We're, you know, the Bible clearly says that in the end times, these forces of darkness will control, and the God of this world, who is Satan, will bring about all these catastrophes that we're beginning to see right now. Again, I'm not here to scare people, but I want people to get prepared because, you know, the COVID was just the beginning of many, many things that we're going to be seeing and are seeing right now, and we need to be prepared for it.
Chaplain, 32 years in the military, you've seen a lot, you've heard a lot. Do you feel that the emphasis that we've seen in the military, starting perhaps with the Obama administration, in which they replaced a lot of experienced military leaders with what some would call political generals, and that seems to be happening once again under President Biden. Do you think this is affecting, first of all, what do you feel about that? And second of all, do you feel that it's affecting the morale of the military?
Well, how I feel about it, I grew up, as you say, 32 years of military. I've seen some of the greatest leaders on the planet in the military. We had some phenomenal people. General Stan McChrystal, for example, who my great friend is Scott McChrystal, and that's his brother. And so he was terminated because of a Rolling Stones article. And so, you know, we've been terminating some of those great military minds and leadership. And so we are in great danger if we start replacing them with yes men or political appointees, because if we're going to get in battle with Russia, with China, it's not going to be like Afghanistan or Iraq. It's going to be all out war. We need the greatest military minds that we can have. And I think we've weakened ourselves when we start replacing them with political appointees that will just say yes to whatever is going on. We need men of war and women of war. And I've had it before. We need it, or we are going to get whipped in this next battle that's coming up.
Now you're talking about the leadership. Recently, the new leadership in the Pentagon, that is after the riot in Washington, D.C. after January 6th, began what appears to be a purge of the troops, looking for those who don't have the correct political philosophy. What's your view on that issue?
Well, that's dangerous. You know, when you go in the Army, you raise your hand and you sign a note to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. I think that ought to be good enough. And the training these guys get are second to none in basic training. So we should have great confidence in our troops and in our military and not second guess anybody in there, because we may have a few in there that may be controversial and want to upset the apple cart, but our leaders, our NCOs, our officers, you know, are some of the best it's ever been. And we need to depend and trust them and stop trying to control the military for your political game. That's what Barack Obama did. He made it a social engineering playground that could have brought us to our knees as a nation.
We've interviewed on this program some folks, both actually mostly retired from the military, who talked about the serious blow to morale of underfunding the military. Uh, Men and women who are on duty far longer than they should be in one tour, people who have been constantly going to battle, people who are on a shift that lasts 16 hours, almost beyond human endurance. How serious is that an issue right now?
Well, Congress always wants its peace dividend. If there's a book called America's First Wars that's required reading in the military, and I read it in War College, we lost every battle from the Civil War, from Revolutionary War, all the way up to now. The reason is we weren't battle ready. We weren't prepared. And so the fact of the matter is it's happening again, where we think we can get this peace dividend and take money from the military without being prepared. It happened in World War II, World War I. We weren't ready, and we got our hind ends kicked because of that. So in our book, The Military Guide to Armageddon, we use our battle-tested strategies I have personally used over the course of 32 years, and I translate them for our civilian population so they can get spiritually, morally, ethically, and financially ready for what's coming.
Chaplain, thank you so much. It was great talking with you. We hope to speak with you again.
Oh, that was awesome. Thank you. I'd love to come back again.
Thank you so much. John, one of the things that you get a sense of when we interview folks, whether it's military, whether they are in the fields of education or religion, is that we have just in the past couple of years gone so far away from what used to be considered normal that it's almost breathtaking in the scope of how much change has occurred. This isn't something that seems to have sprung about from whole cloth. If you look back at what we saw with the slow march to the institutions, the left called it, where they knew they couldn't win at the ballot box, they knew they couldn't win in the court of public opinion, and so they slowly took over education, the media, even entertainment. We're kind of seeing the end result of that now, aren't we?
Absolutely, we are. I mean, we've been fighting this battle against socialism since the inception of Marxist philosophy, since its introduction. But as a nation, we were more united in the past in what our principles were. And again, to echo Daria's point, which is an extremely important one, that's based upon education. We all had a pretty similar education. We were taught some basic philosophy regarding what it is to be an American, what that meant, and how to carry it through. And we've lost that. And I attribute it usually to the 1960s as being when this modern change occurred. In the 1960s, so many of the radical left retreated into academia and became the educators for those, particularly college age. Those college age students then became parents themselves and have continued the indoctrination of their children in this leftist philosophy. And a lot of it was pretty subtle at first and sounded very pleasing. But when you followed through on its logical implications, you saw that it did not hold together at all. So that's been the history, the recent history of the problems we're facing today, is we have seen more and more of these leftist indoctrinated students who now became teachers themselves. And now, as I discuss in the most recent articles I've been publishing with usagovpolicy.com, you're seeing them reaching down into the kindergarten through 12th grade to try to indoctrinate those students, because it's no longer sufficient to indoctrinate them at the college level.
Yeah, it's fascinating. At one time, assimilation was considered a wonderful thing. We came from many lands and many philosophies, many faiths, and we became one people, an American people. Now it seems the entire thrust of education is anti-assimilation, that we all have to go back to our own little tribes, our own little corners. Former mayor of New York City, David Dinkins, used to talk about, instead of assimilation or a melting pot, we are in a mosaic of all sorts of different groups who apparently now are supposed to be all at war with each other or rivaling each other.
I've explained this every opportunity I get, and it's sometimes the focus of the articles that I've published. We are not in a race war. We are in a war against socialism, against Marxism, against communism. To divide us along racial lines or even along class lines is just a false divide. We're all Americans, and what the hallmark of this country has been is the opportunity for advancement. Not that we all like each other or that we're all living in safety or that we don't insult each other. It's that we all have the same equal opportunity to advance ourselves based upon our abilities to advance.
We welcome our newest radio affiliate in Washington, D.C. at 96.7 FM. Watch us throughout the nation on Roku, public broadcast stations on the AMFM247.com network. Tell Alexa to open up the AMFM 24/7 network and play the program. You can access the program anytime on our website, usagovpolicy.com. Join us again next week. We are sponsored by the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, a division of the American Analysis of News and Media, Inc., at usagovpolicy.com and the Institute for American Politics. Email us at truthandradio@gmail.com. Our producer is the amazing Abigail White, and our director is the brilliant Jeff Hansen.